All right, welcome everyone. This is our 9th class in this course on Buddha nature, the Tathagata essence. So let's go ahead and start as we usually do with just a few prayers. Oh, right. Okay. Okay. I think there was the option to make her a co-host as well, but I made her the host, so she has to make me a co-host. Great. Thank you, Sheila. All right, let's go ahead and start with the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha. That again, we'll just do once tonight. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one destroyer, the complete, fully awakened being, perfect, good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. I think we're going to try changing out the microphone, so hold on a second. My microphone is off, I think. Yeah, everything is off. Okay, let's try, see how this works. That sounds better already. So, all right, then the short mandala offering. This ground anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And finally, refuge in Bodhicitta, as usual, the first time in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gipe sanam gi dola penchir sangye drupar sho sangye chodang soki choknam la Jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gipe sanam gi dola penchir sangye drupar sho. Right, then as usual, let's do a short meditation. First few minutes, just focusing on the breath in order to kind of bring yourself into this space, calm the mind a bit, let go of whatever distractions you might have. And then I'll come in a few minutes and lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation together. So I'll ring the bell to start the meditation. So now to set our motivation for tonight, I thought it would be useful to review these 4 perfections that are a part of the resultant state. Now recall we're going through these 10 presentations on Buddha nature. This is the 3rd one. It gives us an idea of what it is that we're striving for when we set our motivation of bodhicitta. What is the result that we're seeking? We can encapsulate that into Buddhahood. But these are 4 particular aspects that show how a Buddha's mind is perfected, a Buddha's state of existence is perfected. On the perfection of purity. Recall that part of our Buddha nature is having a mind that is naturally pure, meaning that there is no inherent existence of the mind whatsoever. We're free of those natural stains. Those stains don't exist. The mind is by its very nature pure. But this perfection of purity is not just that, it's also the purification of the mind of all the defilements. Everything that obscures the mind currently, completely gone. This is an aspect of the resultant state that we are seeking, to have a mind that has been completely purified, removed all of what obscures it. And the second was what was called the perfection of no self. The perfection of self, which essentially is the perfection of no self. When we say a perfect self, we mean the perfect selflessness that we will have realized upon attaining Buddhahood. Right now, we have some idea of what selflessness, emptiness means. That's the seed that eventually grows into this perfection, this perfect self that is the realization of no self, the denial of all fabricated forms of self-existence. This again is a wisdom component of the mind of a Buddha. And the Buddha has the ability to remain in that meditative equipoise, knowing selflessness all the time. And then we have the perfection of highest bliss. Even though we can attain great blissful states through deepening our concentration, and as we move through the path and eventually remove first the afflictive obstructions, and then eventually the knowledge obstructions, throughout this time, we grow in our own inner bliss. Mind becomes more and more blissful. And we won't have achieved the highest bliss until we attain Buddhahood, the perfection of our own well-being, in a sense, bringing us to our greatest state of happiness and well-being, something so far beyond anything we've known. And we have the potential to develop that. Just briefly reflect on that reality, our future existence in that perfect highest bliss. And then finally, their perfect permanence or perfection of permanence. This isn't permanence in the sense of not changing, but rather being able to abide in that non-abiding nirvana, that state that is between the two extremes. We will no longer be in samsara, conditioned existence, but moreover, we will not be in this solitary piece of nirvana. We will have attained a nirvana, but it will be a non-abiding nirvana, not abiding in either of these extremes. And we will then be able to be dedicated fully to the welfare of all beings, having generated great compassion throughout the path. It will culminate in that ability to transcend both samsara and nirvana, and to continue to be a benefit to all beings until they all attain complete enlightenment. This too is an aspect of the resultant state. Just briefly reflect on that being something we're striving for. So as I said earlier, all four of these can be encapsulated in that single word, buddhahood. This is what we're striving to attain. But we generate bodhicitta not with that motivation alone, just for our own welfare, but rather we do it primarily for the welfare of all beings. We will develop our minds completely so we can be of greatest benefit to them. And it's this reason that we're here this evening engaging in these teachings. So just hold that motivation of bodhicitta, which is the seed from which all of these perfections will ensue. They will come forward on the basis of our strong bodhicitta motivation and all the practices that support our complete development into Buddhahood. And that's why we're here this evening. Okay, so I did a short review of what we covered last week, these four perfections, but I'm going to do a little bit more as part of this evening's kind of getting us back into this topic. We didn't finish this section. What I'd like to do before we even get into the material, though, is actually there was a question a couple of classes ago, and I was unable to find the reference from the Dalai Lama that I thought I had seen or read somewhere. The question had to do with essentially, is there sort of one Dharmakaya? When you become a Buddha, does everything become like one huge wisdom mind that then is kind of dedicated to the welfare of all beings? And I actually found when Geshe Tenzin Tempo was teaching on Buddha nature, Tathagata essence, he answered this question. A student said concerning this point, you said that when beings reach enlightenment, they are not distinguishable in terms of their qualities, right? Because you can't say, oh, this Buddha has more qualities than that Buddha. It's an equal state of Buddhahood. All of these perfections that we were talking about now being complete. So he says here, so on what basis can they be distinguished? And Geshe Tenzin Tempo said they can be distinguished on the basis of there being individual continua. Each being, again, has their own continuum of mind that eventually becomes the mind of that Buddha. So while, again, we might not be able to say it's distinguishable in terms of the qualities that it possesses, it is unique in terms of its own continuum, that is that mind of that being, our own minds right now that are here together with our aggregates and going forward into that state of enlightenment. So then the student asked, if there are multitudes of Buddhas, it would follow that there are a multitude of truth bodies. And he said, that's right. From the point of view of their nature, they are indistinguishable. From the point of view of their qualities, they are not different. However, their qualities have different supports. Therefore, even though their qualities are indistinguishable, they have these different supports, these being the mental continua of different sentient beings who previously progressed along the path and eventually became Buddhas. So again, you have that continuity that is distinct. And I mentioned when this question came up that there is a passage in Path to Bliss where His Holiness speaks to the fact that the people you will most benefit when you become a Buddha are those that you've had proximate karmic connections with in your most recent lifetimes, those beings who have been in your circle, who you've influenced through your closeness to them and the karma you have with them. They will benefit most immediately and directly from your enlightenment. It doesn't mean others won't benefit. It means that is sort of, they're caught up in the wake of your Buddhahood, if you will. And so they will have that energy that will propel them more quickly to enlightenment. We often hear this from some of our teachers that we should think about the beings who we have in our lives as beings who we might be their Buddha. It's kind of strange to think that, but at some point we might be what will make a difference in whether they become enlightened or not. If we become enlightened, we will again bring them in our wake and they will achieve enlightenment much more quickly. Whereas if we don't, then who will do that for them? Where will be the connection with another potential Buddha or Buddha? So again, this is just something to think about. Let me put on the screen real quickly the chart. And again, this is the chart on the 10 presentations that we have been working with and using quite regularly. And I'll use it again tonight when we go through the rest of this, as well as go into the next one. I'm hoping we can get to number 4, which is the function of Buddha nature. So just to remind you, we have these 4 perfections that are in that second column. That column, again, we meditated on those, so I won't review the meaning of those, but we're going to see them again very briefly. We see that the 4 causes that were the second topic in the 10 presentations, those 4 causes are in this middle column here. And that is kind of tied one to each of these perfections. And that's also where we're going to start tonight, is taking a look at how those are connected. Then we have these individuals who are kind of involved in having particular hindrances, and the causes act in particular to help them to overcome those hindrances and to achieve these perfections. So again, I'll talk about that a little bit more tonight when we get into that. And then in this last column was just this presentation of results. This is kind of giving the purpose of this presentation. Let me just read this to review what we're doing here. It shows that the result of purifying the lineage, the Buddha nature, of the 4 obstructions leads to the resultant 4 perfect purities of a Buddha. These 4 perfections, again, that we just meditated on. The fact that the mind is by nature pure and that the stains are adventitious, these are the 2 main topics that we're dealing with throughout this course. The natural purity of the mind, and then that the stains are adventitious so we can achieve adventitious purity. This is shown by way of indicating that perfect purity is attainable through causes that purify the mind or the lineage of stains. So this is, again, why we're looking at this in particular with regard to this topic, is to understand that through these causes, we can purify the mind and thereby attain these 4 perfections. So let's go to the, I mentioned last week that I was going to skip over this section. Maybe I'll just take it off screen for a moment. We're skipping over essentially like pages 109 through 111. What happens in that section, just so you have some idea, if anyone ever asks you, well, what's in that section? Don didn't teach on it, but essentially what it is they talk about how even beings who are at a very, very high level of achievement, such as hearers who have attained arhatship, solitary realizers who have attained arhatship, and then, of course, bodhisattvas, who are equivalent in terms of what they have removed, the afflictive obstructions, who are on the pure grounds. Even those beings, although they have attained an incredible amount of purity within their minds, aren't yet at the state of Buddhahood. And they talk about 4 sort of obstructions that they have, 4 hindrances is what they're called in that text, in that part of the text. They're not the same as the 4 obstructions that we went through when we went through cause, when we went through the second presentation. But know that they are essentially identifying how, in general, what's happening to these beings is that because they haven't purified their minds completely, because they haven't gotten rid of all of this, the latencies of ignorance and so on, they still are caught to some degree in a conditioned state, not conditioned in the way that ours is in terms of karma and delusions, but conditioned by other factors, even conditioned to some degree by uncontaminated karma that keeps them in a state where they have what's called a mental body. A mental body is not a physical body, it is a mental body, a sort of place of that's a sort of receptacle for the mind, that when these hearers and solitary realizers exit from this world, because they have attained that arhatship, there's nothing to propel them from from that existence to another one, they will essentially abide in these mental bodies. And even bodhisattvas at these high levels have mental bodies that are essentially having emanations of physical bodies and so on. But they aren't at the level of Buddhahood, where they have removed all of the obscurations and able to no longer be kind of contained by that mental body. So what is going on in that section, just so you know, is kind of a whole discussion of those beings who are at this very high level, who haven't yet achieved these 4 perfections, and kind of what they kind of need to do in order to accomplish that. Obviously, continue the process of purification. Recall that for the hearers and the solitary realizers, when they exit from this world, they abide in that state of solitary peace in this mental body. And they don't really do anything. They're not taking rebirth, of course, because they haven't created that karma. That karma's exhausted. They aren't wanting to be in existence because they don't have the great compassion and the wish to benefit others that the bodhisattvas do. So they just abide in that state of solitary peace. And they say that can go on for an incredibly long time, when eventually they are stirred out of that by a Buddha and told, you need to complete the path. You have some work to do yet, which must be really depressing, right? To think that you've made it out of samsara, you've exited, but that's not your final destination. According to Prasangika Madhyamaka, the tenets that we're studying, there's one final vehicle. All beings have to eventually enter that. That means the Mahayana is the path for everyone. If you can have the karma to go through it from the beginning, it makes much more sense, because then you don't go through the fundamental vehicle path, become an arhat, check out, abide in solitary peace, and then eventually have to go back and complete the entire Mahayana path again, or another whole path again. Again, I don't want to go too deeply into that, but that's what happens in that section that we've passed over. Is essentially it talks about these four obstacles or hindrances that they have, identifying what are the problems that are going on for them that keep them from having these four perfections, even though, again, they've attained this incredible state of purity. So where we're going to jump in today, then, in terms of getting us back into this topic, is page 112 of your commentary, if you've printed it out. If it's in a PDF file, then as it shows on the screen there, it's page 116, again, because there's a couple of pages at the beginning that aren't numbered. So here we get into an individual discussion of these four perfections. Verse 136 says, because the Dharmakaya is pure by nature, that's the natural purity, again, that we talked about in the meditation tonight, and has abandoned the adventitious defilements as well as the imprints, it is the perfection of purity. Again, we have two aspects to the perfection of purity. It's pure by nature, and it also has purity of adventitious defilements. Then the next two lines, it is the highest self, having pacified the elaborations of self and selflessness. So here we talked about this last week. When we talk about the perfection of self, we mean the perfection of no self, and that you have realized that none of these fabricated selves exist, from the coarsest ones to the subtlest level of self, which again is the inherently existent self. And that selflessness, that lack of that, also is selfless. So we have achieved kind of a full understanding. The wisdom mind of a Buddha knows the selflessness and at the greatest degree. So it's a perfect self by virtue of having perfected no self. And in verse 137, the next verse, it says, this is the third of the perfections. It is the perfection of bliss, because of having reversed the aggregates of a mental nature and their causes. So this is what we're talking about with regard to this mental body, this they called here aggregates of a mental nature and their causes. Recall that when the bodhisattva has gotten rid of all of the afflictive obscurations, they go on to remove all the knowledge obscurations. But as I just said a short while ago, they still have this mental body that kind of keeps them in some level of conditioning, not again samsaric conditioning, but you're not at the level of achieving buddhahood yet. So you have to remove the causes of that, which are these subtle obscurations and knowledge obscurations in the mind. The fourth one, it is the perfection of permanence, as it realizes samsara and nirvana to be equal in nature. There's a lot of ways that permanence is talked about, but essentially it means to find this sort of middle way between the two extremes of samsara and nirvana, to realize their equalness in terms of their lack of inherent existence, but moreover, to also realize that conventionally, it's an error to fall into samsara, of course, because we're in the quicksand with everybody, as I said last week, and we can't help others because of that. But moreover, we don't want to fall into the extreme of nirvana, the solitary peace that I just talked about in regard to the Hinayana fundamental vehicle practitioners. So let's look at the paragraph on this. It says here, the Dharmakaya of the Tathagatas is the perfection of purity, the first perfection. Because it is pure by nature, and all imprints of mental affliction are abandoned forever. So again, we see those two aspects of purity being mentioned here. Secondly, it is the perfection of highest self, because it is pervaded by a pacification in which it directly perceives as non-existent the elaborations of a truly existing no self, and the self imputed by the outsiders, as well as all other selves that would be fabricated. So again, any of our adhering to the self of selflessness or the self of these various other views would be refuted at that time, completely seen as non-existent. And it says there, because of the non-arising of all elaborations of the appearance of duality by relying upon no self. Again, we no longer have any of the stains that would cause that dualistic appearance that we are all bound by, to continue to see things as inherently existent. This is the part of these knowledge obstructions that needs to be removed. Third one, it is the perfection of bliss because it has removed by complete abandonment the aggregates of a mental nature formed by non-afflicted ignorance and non-afflicted karma. Again, these uncontaminated states produce a mental body that the bodhisattvas as well as the arhats have, and the causes of that need to be removed. The ground of imprints of ignorance and karma, kind of the support upon all that, which again is part of our knowledge obstructions. It is the perfection of permanence, the fourth perfection, because it perceives samsara and nirvana as equal, as both are empty by nature. And again, as I said, it's also a conventional component to that. We're going to see that a little bit later tonight. This is the ultimate severance from the extremes of samsara and peace, which again are obstacles for the bodhisattva. The bodhisattva does not want either of those extremes. They want to steer clear of both of them because they're traps, all right? Now I'm going to go through the commentary. I'll try to go through this somewhat quickly because it's saying a lot of the things we've already talked about, but it's giving a little more definition to what we call the two causes for each of these, which don't quite line up exactly with what's on your chart. So I'll go back and forth between the chart and this. But it says here, the lines beginning to summarize by two causes. Remember, anything in bold is from a Sangha's commentary on Maitreya's text, which Gyaltsab Je is commenting on. He says this section talks of its purity by nature as a general characteristic and the thorough purity of being divorced from the defilements eradicated by the antidotes as a particular characteristic. So those are the two purities that we are kind of the two causes of having the perfection of purity. So when we go back to this fourth column here where it says the person with desire for samsara, blah, 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 they have the result, the highest purity. The two purities of the nature body. This is actually the one that is defined most closely with the nature body. Remember, the nature body is primarily the emptiness of the mind, which is its natural purity, and then the freedom from the adventitious defilements, which is that additional purity that you've attained through the path. So we see both of those freedoms being talked about there: freedom from the natural stain, true existence, and freedom from adventitious stains, the afflictive and knowledge obstructions, all right? Or obscurations. Okay, so then let's go back to the next one. This is again the perfection of self. The following lines, beginning by two causes, explain that by being free of holding to the self of persons asserted by the outsiders, and which causes one to fall to the extreme of samsara, it is free of the elaborations of self. Again, that one's being highlighted, these kind of extreme, coarser views of a self, but we can say we've denied all of these views of a self, all the elaborations of self. Although it directly, that's the first cause in a sense, although it directly perceives the no self of the hearers, it does not fall to that extreme of peace and is therefore free of the elaborations of no self. Again, we don't hold to the inherent existence of no self or selflessness either. So it says there, this teaches freedom from the two extremes, from the point of view of the result. However, to explain freedom from the two extremes from the point of view of what is realized, freedom from the elaboration of self is the realization of the non-existence of the two types of self. And freedom from the elaborations of no self is to perceive the two types of no self as not existing by their own natures. So again, it kind of defines it more clearly there. When we talk about the first, it's denying any form of self that we could put forward, self of person, self of phenomena, whatever. And then we deny also those two selflessnesses, the lack of a self of persons and the lack of a self of phenomena. All right. And it says the fading of the appearance of duality by relying on no self is freedom from the elaborations of the mode of perception. So for this one, again, we see that for that column 4, where we've got the second person, a person with wrong views of a self, they come to realize the two selflessnesses. Now, this is the first part, really. I mean, they've got this underlined as if it's the two causes, but it's really the first cause. Again, the first cause is to realize the selflessness of these coarser views of a self, as well as any of the other views of self, whereby all wrong views regarding a self of persons and of phenomena are abandoned. And then secondly would be also realizing the selflessness of that selflessness. Again, it's just kind of adding on emptiness of emptiness, selflessness of selflessness. Even emptiness itself is empty of inherent existence. So not only do we refute the fabricated self that we've been living with, all the various iterations of that, we also refute the selflessness that is the emptiness of that. All right. I think everyone's getting it. And we hear these things. That's what's nice about the commentary. In some ways, we keep getting kind of the points in different perspectives from the root verses, as well as why is this? Come on, my screen is being weird on me. Up, went too far. Okay, the third one also has two causes. By two causes, bliss, the perfection of bliss, this teaches the following: all forms of suffering and causes of suffering, in terms of the two types of obscuration, are abandoned. Therefore, all linking to future birth by the imprints of ignorance, which is responsible for similar type perpetuation, is abandoned. Also, let me go to the next page and then we'll comment on this a little. Because the cessation of suffering in all its forms is directly actualized, the cessation of the bodies of a mental nature is directly actualized. So what we're talking about here is that you have this bliss that, as it said there at the bottom, is due to all of the causes of suffering and all forms of suffering being abandoned. You no longer have anything that would cause you to not experience bliss, well-being, happiness, peace. But moreover, you've also abandoned, as it says on that next page, this mental body, which again is a subtle form that I'm sure there's great bliss in being in this state. You know, you're free of all of what has been contaminating your existence since beginningless time, but you're not yet at the highest bliss of Buddhahood. So these two things are the causes. So when we go back to the chart here, this is the one that has kind of both of these indicated, but once more, it underlines the two obscurations as if they're the two causes. I'm thinking, I don't know, I didn't put this chart together. What we essentially say is this person, this third person, a person with strong fear of samsara, they develop deep concentration, practice all of the trainings, and they overcome first the two obscurations, which keeps them from having anything that kind of limits their potential for bliss. And then upon having overcome even the mental body, comes to be endowed with the uncontaminated highest bliss of Buddhahood. So again, the one that was talked about mainly in the text that we just looked at was the first obscuration, the afflictive obscurations. Because once you abandon the knowledge obscurations, then you will abandon the mental body. You no longer have a mental body at that point. So it's a little, the wording here is a little strange. You first overcome the afflictive obscurations, which keep you from experiencing any sort of peace, happiness, due to having the suffering and the causes of suffering, dukkha, and so on. But then you also go on to remove the mental body, which is done when you achieve freedom from the knowledge obscurations. Okay, let's go back to the text. What we're going to see for the perfection of patience is a little bit longer description. It has its own section. Let's go through the section here where it gives the meaning of all of this. It says the lines beginning in a Sangha's commentary, by two causes permanence, teach the following. Falling to the extremes of samsara and peace meaning that state of nirvana, that solitary peace, occurs in terms of the conventional truth and the ultimate truth. So it's a little bit longer presentation because it has two aspects to it. And that was even what we saw when we went through the verse, right? Is that We can talk about it in terms of them being equal in nature, having both the same ultimate truth of emptiness, but in conventional terms, they are different. And we do identify them as two different extremes that we have to be wary of on the bodhisattva path. So first, this is the conventional samsara. To link to a future birth by the power of karma and affliction is to fall to the extreme of samsara in terms of the conventional truth. Right? This is what we normally talk about as a fear of samsara, right? Is continuing to be under the control of our karma and delusions, to go through the wheel of life, as we all know from those teachings, to be propelled from life to life. And that's an extreme that obviously bodhisattvas don't want to fall into because, as I said, they're in the quicksand then with everyone else. They can't help others. Now, another extreme of samsara that is included here, though, is the next sentence. It says, not only putting an end to that process, but also stopping birth by being, my little things on top of this, by being taken through the force of compassion and prayer, thereby holding the view that just birth itself in samsara is the phenomenon to be negated, is also to fall to the extreme of samsara. So let's stop there for a moment. Let me take it off screen. What is this saying? It's saying, first of all, bodhisattvas developed this sincere wish to abandon samsara. This is part of developing renunciation, which precedes bodhicitta. But they can also have a false view if they think somehow that the continuation of being in samsara, that a bodhisattva has a great desire to be in samsara through the force of their compassion and prayers. They want to continue to abide to be able to benefit other beings, right? Well, that, if you think that just taking rebirth, regardless of whether it's by karma and afflictions or through compassion and prayer, that's an obstacle and you want to avoid it, that's an extreme. Because bodhisattvas want to keep cultivating that wish to be involved in samsara through their great compassion and their prayers. Why? Because that's what Buddhas do, right? Buddhas don't give up on that. Buddhas don't abandon that. They don't say, oh, I don't want to be involved in samsara anymore through compassion and prayers. That's exactly what a Buddha wants to do, right? So, and another extreme that we could talk about in regard to samsara is where we've turned away from samsara and we want to abandon being reborn through karma and delusions. But we moreover want to abandon being reborn through compassion and prayers. That would be an extreme because that will keep us from achieving Buddhahood, right? Because that's not the answer, to abandon that. We have to have that intact in order to become a Buddha. So let's go back to it. And now we're going to talk about nirvana in terms of conventional truth. The nirvana, this is kind of, again, where it says 124 there, but the nirvana that is attained in dependence on that view and the striving toward that nirvana constitute the extreme of peace. This is what we know, right? That if you through the force of that type of thinking that we just talked about with the bodhisattva wanting to abandon any form of rebirth, any way of being involved in samsara, if you strive then for solitary peace and nirvana, then you're going to fall into that extreme. So you don't want to abandon being involved in the world through the force of your compassion and prayer and head for the extreme of nirvana, the exit out, so you no longer have to suffer and, just take care of yourself. Instead, you want to find this middle way again between those two. Those are the conventional truths in regard to the extremes of samsara and nirvana. Any aim that we go to move to that nirvana that's a solitary peace and leave behind all sentient beings would be a grave error. Now, in terms of ultimate truth, it's very clear. To hold a truly existing samsara and a truly existing nirvana as phenomena to be discarded and cultivated is to fall to the extremes of samsara and peace in terms of the ultimate truth. So if we have a false perception that samsara is inherently existent or that nirvana is inherently existent, this too is an extreme that we want to avoid. In terms of ultimate truth, samsara and nirvana are equal, as we saw earlier. They both lack inherent existence. Sometimes we see in some Buddhist teachings that these two are made equivalent, right? Samsara is nirvana, nirvana is samsara. Well, that's in terms of their ultimate nature. Again, they both lack any true existence, inherent existence, and we have to deny that on both of those bases. However, conventionally, we saw they are very different, right? The Bodhisattva sees them both as a trap, though. If I fall into the trap of samsara, well, that's where I'm at. I don't really want to continue being here, and then I can't do much good if I haven't developed my mind. But if I, on the other hand, fall into the trap of nirvana, well, then I check out, and go hang out in a peaceful state, and leave others to kind of figure their way out themselves. Neither of these are the response that we want. Let's go back to the commentary, and what we're going to do here is skip over a couple of pages, well, actually to the top of the next page, page 114. So let me go there, and we're going to see a final verse in regard to this, but we have a little introduction to this. This section is interesting. It's called Compassion and the Realization of Emptiness in the Continuum of a Bodhisattva as the Root of the Dharmakaya. We've been talking about these four causes, right? But if you boil them down to their essence in terms of what will allow you to achieve buddhahood, it's wisdom and compassion, right? No big surprise. We work with this all the time as a concept in Tibetan Buddhism, right? So let's look at the pre-root text commentary before we actually look at the root text. What was said above is, let me push it up just a little bit here. What was said above is true, but it only talks of the attainment of the non-abiding nirvana, which without distinction is not near to or far from any sentient being, and is produced by two causes that negate the extremes of samsara and nirvana, period. I shouldn't say and there. So again, we have these two causes that we could single out that say are the main causes for achieving non-abiding nirvana, for not ending up in either of these extremes of samsara or nirvana. Again, nirvana being equivalent to solitary peace there. But what are these two causes? Arya bodhisattvas are not near to any sentient beings because they've abandoned all dormant tendencies for the arising of samsara through the wisdom that directly realizes impermanence, suffering, and so forth, and emptiness. So by near to, we mean in the quicksand with everybody else. You're not in the quicksand with everybody else because you've transcended samsara. You have removed all of what keeps you bound in that state of conditioned existence. Then it goes on to say the extreme of falling to samsara in terms of the ultimate truth is negated by the wisdom realizing emptiness. However, the extreme of believing that mere birth in samsara is the phenomenon to be halted is prevented by compassion and the power of prayer. So remember, we highlighted that as the second sort of extreme of samsara, is when we think that we're going to halt birth completely and not continue to be involved in the world through our compassion and prayers. That's a fault that we have to get rid of. We have to make sure that we generate the compassion and the power of prayer to continue to be involved in the suffering of sentient beings, which is what Buddhas are all about. They don't abandon beings for a second. It is possible to link this particular passage from the commentary to the previous passage, but because it appears to comment on the next verse, it's presented here as a pre-root text commentary. We don't need to comment on that. Bodhisattvas are also not far from sentient beings because with their great compassion, they will not abandon them. So that's the idea of being far from them. Near means you're in the same boat as them, the quicksand with them. Far means you're going to be hanging out in solitary peace, right? Where you can just check out and say, see you all later, hope you make it here eventually. Instead you're going to, through your compassion, say, there's no way I'm going to abandon these beings. I'm going to do whatever it takes to remove every one of them from the sort of quicksand of existence of samsara. So then it goes on to say, this special method is the way to attain the complete enlightenment whose nature does not abide in the extremes of samsara and nirvana. First, with the wisdom that realizes impermanence and so forth and emptiness, Arya bodhisattvas eliminate all dormant tendencies for samsara and thereby accomplish their own welfare. This is a state of mind that relies upon nirvana and therefore does not abide in the extreme of samsara. This is unlike those who are of a lineage that will not attain nirvana for the time being because they have great attachment and therefore no wish for nirvana. We talked about those folks earlier, right? The above text means that these bodhisattvas have found the antidotes to destroy the dormant tendencies of samsara, not that all have been destroyed completely, but they have found the way out and they are dedicated to doing that. They are going to remove themselves from the extreme of samsara and attain the peace of nirvana. Again, not solitary peace in this case, because it's going to be non-abiding nirvana, But nonetheless, they have to do that work. That's how you achieve your own welfare. Your own welfare is to get yourself out of samsaric existence. Remove yourself from that extreme. But then it goes on to say at the bottom of the page there, motivated by great compassion, they take birth in samsara in order not to abandon suffering beings. They therefore fulfill the welfare of others. This is an action that relies on samsara, and so, unlike those of the lineage that travel alone to their peace, again, those in the hearer and solitary realizer paths, these bodhisattvas do not abide in the extreme of nirvana. So again, they find this sort of middle way between these two, and this is something that is emphasized in this section, but we're going to see it coming up in terms of function as well. We have to really genuinely want to be free from samsara and attain nirvana, but we don't want to fall into either extreme. We want to make sure that we find this middle way where we can be in this non-abiding nirvana. Recall that's the meaning of non-abiding there, not abiding in either extreme. Fulfilling our own welfare by being free of samsara, but also fulfilling the welfare of others by not checking out into solitary peace. Okay? Pretty straightforward, but just a lot of words to get to this meaning. Let's go to the next page. And here we get into a little kind of link. First, I think, whoops, I went too far, sorry. No, I didn't. What did I do here? Okay, there it is. Therefore, these two phenomena of wisdom and compassion are taught as being the root causes of the highest enlightenment. That's why we talk about them all the time. Remember, they're the two wings of a bird that allow that bird to fly to the island of enlightenment. Let's go through root verse 38. With wisdom, it severs all clinging to self. Because of clinging to sentient beings, those endowed with compassion do not reach the extreme of peace. By trusting the methods for enlightenment, compassion, and here it's called cognition, wisdom, the Aryas do not turn to the extremes of samsara or nirvana, meaning the Arya bodhisattvas. So with wisdom, you stop clinging to the self, which is what's at the root of samsara, that ignorance. With being dedicated to sentient beings, having devotion to them and wanting to help them, those endowed with compassion don't fall into the other extreme of peace. So first, the Arya bodhisattvas have severed all clinging to self through the wisdom that realizes impermanence and so forth, as well as emptiness, and does not dwell in the extreme of samsara. Yet they cling to all sentient beings with the desire to free them from suffering. Therefore, the compassionate bodhisattva does not reach the extreme of peace. In this way, by prolonged meditation on the method for the actualization of the highest enlightenment, categorized by the wisdom as explained above, and secondly, by compassion, the Arya Bodhisattva does not fall to the extremes of samsara and nirvana. Okay. Where did I go? Somehow I did something that took me back a page. All right. Then it says here, one earlier commentator, when commenting on the verse, by knowledge, no dwelling in samsara, by compassion, no dwelling in peace, which is from Maitreya's other text that we studied in the Master's Program, Ornament for Clear Realization, explains the negation of the extreme of samsara as referring solely to the wisdom realizing emptiness. That's these two things act in tandem. It's not like one is an alone, separate, solitary cause for that result. It says here, this clearly shows a lack of understanding because both Arya Vimuktasena and Acharya Haribhadra, who are renowned for having done some of the initial commentaries on that text, explain it as referring to the wisdom that sees the faults of samsara, and the faults of samsara are realized with a conventional valid cognition, not by a valid cognition of ultimate truth. There's a lot that goes into our achieving the freedom from samsara, right? It's not just the wisdom realizing emptiness. That's not done independently of generating the wish to be free of that by seeing the faults of samsara. This is actually what leads us into the next topic, which is the function of Buddha nature, to help us to have that realization, to see clearly the faults of samsara and the benefits of nirvana or peace. Then it says to complete this section, I don't know if I can comment that much on this. The hearers described above as traveling alone to their peace are to be understood as those who, for the time being, are of definite lineage, and not as they are described by the Yogacara, who take the sutra unraveling the thought as literal. again, we do have this concept that I mentioned previously where some tenets, such as some of the Yogacharan schools say that there are three final vehicles, meaning that if you take the hearer path and achieve arhatship, or the solitary realizer path and achieve arhatship, or the bodhisattva path and achieve buddhahood, that's where you stay. You don't get beckoned back into the Mahayana for those who have achieved arhatship. So again, this is saying that here we're talking about those who are definite in lineage to get through the hearer or the solitary realizer path, but then they complete the final vehicle of the Mahayana eventually. Now, one thing I didn't cover last week that I was in my slides, and I'm just going to touch on briefly. Remember that I did have this handout. Let me put that on the screen very briefly. I've got a handout on verse 35 that had this. Let me see if I can find which one it is. No, that's the one for tonight. This is it. It essentially is going through these four causes that produce these four results that have a role in removing these four misconceptions that we have regarding the conventional truth and regarding ultimate truth. I'm not going to go through all of these. I just want to mention I did this last week. I didn't really go through kind of the additional commentary from Geshe Sonam Rinchen and also kind of how he talks about how these four causes kind of work against these. And it's very brief and it's not that complete. And so I just want to at least go through those slides real quickly before we kind of move on to the next topic. All right. So bear with me and then we'll be done with this third presentation. So let me put the slides on. Again, these were in last week's slides, but then I put them at the beginning of this week's. Okay, so he starts by saying the third of these points, he calls it effect, result, same meaning, refers to the fact that the result of this purification and development is the truth body of an enlightened one. That's what we mean by those four perfections, is the Dharmakaya, which again has a nature truth body and has a wisdom truth body. The truth body, Dharmakaya, is utterly beyond all misperceptions that what is impermanent is permanent, what is painful is pleasurable, what is unclean is clean, and what is empty of itself has a self. Remember, those are the four misconceptions we looked at that I just had up on that chart. These are the misconceptions we have about our state of existence, about the true sufferings. These are the first things we need to remove, and we need to remove them conventionally, but then we also need to remove any adhering to them as inherently existent. And again, I've changed the order of Geshe Sonam Rinchen's text just so it's in the same order as what we've been discussing, all right? So the first noble truth, true suffering, as I mentioned last week, has four features: impermanence, calls the second one painfulness, and we often call it misery or suffering, uncleanness or impurity, and four, selflessness. Understanding these features enables one to overcome the misperceptions. The misperceptions that one, what is impermanent is permanent, two, what is painful is pleasurable, three, what is unclean is clean, and four, what is empty of a self as a self, are distortions with regard to the conventional nature of things, right? This is why the Buddha taught them first, is because we have to, as I said last week, remove that initial ignorance that is adhering to things wrong conventionally or in a grosser way, because remember, this empty of a self is referring to a coarser form of selflessness, the lack of a substantially existent self-sufficient self, that kind of a head salesperson in a sales department. Remember that analogy, kind of someone who's in charge of the aggregates, if you will. We have to refute all of these before we can go on to realize the ultimate nature of things. So Geshe Sonam Rinchen says to get rid of them, we need to understand well the four features of the First Noble Truth, which are diametrically opposed to these four misconceptions. Recognizing the body's impermanence, its disintegrating nature, and how it is governed by other factors, it's under the control of other factors, right? Helps us to overcome the idea that the body is permanent and clean. I inserted permanent there because obviously he's trying to get at its refuting its permanence by saying impermanent. But essentially, when we come to understand the conditioned nature of this body, that it is changing constantly, there's nothing permanent within the body. And due to that, that's why it's unclean or impure, right? Here we are in this hot summer weather, right? And you can see how impure the body is, how quickly you become hot and sweaty and you need a shower. And then when you get out of the shower, you feel like you're clean, but you're not really clean. You just removed the sort of superficial impurities, so then it says the next one, understanding its painful nature counteracts our sense of the body as a source of pleasure. Understanding emptiness, and I got a footnote on that. Don't misconstrue that as meaning the subtle emptiness of an inherently existent self, but rather, as set out in the sentence, the much coarser emptiness of a permanent, partless, independent self. Or again, self-sufficient, substantially existent self. But we see again that we have to initially generate that antidote. If we have that misconception that there's some sort of permanent, partless, independent self, again, that's kind of like a soul or the Atman that was held by the Hindu traditions, while recognizing its coarse selflessness is an antidote to the conception of the self as a substantially existent, self-sufficient entity. So again, we need to still realize these, even though they're coarser views of selflessness, they are still conventional truths that we need to know. We need to be aware of how things actually exist. So then, having dealt with the conventional, we go on to deal with the ultimate. In this context, misconception in relation to the ultimate consists of thinking that impermanence, painfulness, uncleanness, and selflessness have true existence. We might really think, oh, I've seen things as they are. They're all impermanent. That's the real truth. That's what inherently exists. But no, it too doesn't exist inherently, as all phenomena don't exist inherently. So the selflessness or emptiness referred to here in the presentation in relation to conventional truth is a coarse level. When subtle selflessness, lack of inherent existence, has been understood, there's no danger that it could be construed as truly existent. If you've really realized it, you know that there is no such thing as inherent existence of anything. Remember, I mentioned that last time, Arya Deva, who says in his 400 stanzas that one who realizes the emptiness of one phenomenon realizes the emptiness of all phenomena. So how do those four factors, to get to my final point that I really was sharing all this for, how do those four factors that we talked about, these four causal factors that were in the second presentation, how do they work in relation to these misperceptions or misconceptions is what I would use? Let's take a look at that. Belief, again, in the devotion to the Mahayana, the wisdom realizing selflessness, meditative stabilization, samadhi, and then great compassion. First, a strong belief in the Mahayana teachings counteracts any dislike for them, as we saw, and also a liking for the unclean nature of cyclic existence, and thus leads to perfect purity. So it makes some sense that we start generating this devotion to the Mahayana, we begin seeing things more clearly as they are. Any dislike towards the Mahayana itself, as well as a liking for the samsara and the unclean nature of this existence, eventually leads to perfect purity. It's kind of a little forced, but nonetheless, I think it's worth sharing. Secondly, wisdom understanding the nature of reality, of course, this one's easy to see, counters attachment to diverse wrong views of the self, and thus leads to the perfected excellent self of the truth body mentioned above. So again, this is where we match that one up with the false views of a self, that we need to see that selflessness in order to counteract that. Third, meditative stabilization, that was the third of these causes, leads to perfect bliss derived from total concentration and counters the attachment to the pleasures of cyclic existence. This one makes perfect sense, right? Because this becomes, as we saw in the analogy for the four causes, this is the womb in which the child is developing. So we have this protection of the bliss of concentration that keeps the afflictions from being bothersome, keeps the mind from being agitated, and therefore we don't have all this attachment to the pleasures of cyclic existence, getting caught up in all of the samsaric garbage, because we have that blissful state that occurs on the basis of meditative stabilization. Fourth, great compassion leads to perfect permanence, because through extensive familiarity with compassion, there's an uninterrupted constant flow of it for all living beings. And the view of the body and other conditioned phenomena as permanent is also opposed. And this one's a little harder for me to get all the details of how our meditation on great compassion leads to an understanding of impermanence, if you will, overcoming our view of conditioned phenomena as permanent. But I guess, again, this is kind of one way of looking at these through Geshe Sonam's teachings. Most of the other teachers didn't really deal with this in terms of those who I'm using their commentaries and so on. So I'm kind of leaving it at that, but I just wanted to at least introduce that to you because Otherwise, whoops, I didn't need to do that. Let me do the stop share. Otherwise, you might read those in the thing and say, well, Don didn't even go over those. I'm not sure what those are about. Geshe Sonam's book is kind of nice. It's very brief, though. And so sometimes when he's making comments, I'm always kind of questioning whether everything is there that he taught. But most of the teachers don't really talk about that. Remember, we did have those 4 misconceptions that are overcome by these 4 causes, and thereby the 4 resultant perfections are achieved. So we can see that this is a part of the process. Sometimes it's not always completely lined up, though. So don't expect everything to be perfect in terms of this. So that is in kind of the complete presentation of result. I think last time it took me 3 or 4 classes to get through it. So at least this time it only took 2, and I still have a little bit of time so I can go through function, hopefully. I'll see if there are questions. Hold on to your questions. If there are any questions, hopefully be able to stop function even a little bit earlier if I don't get through it and have an opportunity to take some of your questions. The 4th one is kind of an interesting one. Remember, we had an introduction to function back in verse 34, I believe it was. Let me see. I want to introduce function first by going to the chart. I like to go to this chart because, again, this is the chart that all of you are working with, the materials you've been provided when you registered. So let me pull this, push this up a little bit. Okay, I think that's fine. We're at the position on the screen. Function is on page 4 of the charts. It's verse 39 is the main one that looks at this, but let's look at the next column. I'm going to take issue with what's on this chart. Again, I wasn't a part of preparing these, and I don't know who was the commentator that gave rise to this set of 3 here. The functions of the Tathagata essence or lineage. Well, first, let's go to the last column, because I think it's useful to talk about that. Again, that's more like the purpose of this presentation. The last column says, the topic of function presents by scriptural proof and reasoning that all sentient beings are capable of purifying their minds of adventitious stains and attaining nirvana. Kind of interesting, the argument's going to be put forward that if you didn't have Buddha nature, you couldn't develop the wish to achieve Buddhahood and to abandon samsara and to achieve some level of nirvana. That wouldn't happen if you didn't have Buddha nature. And it makes some sense, right? Because if you don't have a mind that is empty of inherent existence, then the mind would always have the same continuity of thoughts and awareness, which would be samsaric existence. You would never generate thought to abandon it, nor to achieve nirvana. We'll get to that when we get through this topic. That's the purpose of presenting function, is that we can see the functioning of Buddha nature in terms of sentient beings developing a wish to abandon samsara, seeing the faults of it, and a wish to develop the causes for nirvana by seeing the benefits of that. So let's go back to then again, the one I started with that I just moved away from, that second column. It says the functions of the Tathagata essence or lineage are 3-fold here. I'd say they are 2-fold. They are the first 2. To generate the wish to abandon samsara, of course, by seeing its faults. Having Buddha nature allows you to see the faults of samsara and then to wish to generate, a desire to be free of it. 2, to generate the desire to attain nirvana by seeing the benefits of nirvana. And we are able to, through all of what we're studying, see that there is a state that can be achieved where all the causes of samsara will be removed, and that peace can be attained. Of course, in solitary peace for the solitary realizers and hearers, but moreover the non-abiding nirvana, which is still a pacification of all the causes of suffering, but is, a state where we can then be a benefit to others. The third thing that's tacked on here, to seek a method to accomplish that aim, I think what they're doing is taking one little comment that comes up in our commentary and making a third point out of it. Gyaltsen in his commentary says there are 2 functions. The 2 functions are the first 2, to see the faults of samsara and wish to abandon it, to see the benefits of nirvana and wish to attain it. So I don't know if those of you who are doing the basic program who eventually take the final exam, just bring this up in your studying when there's like the 3-month preparation for the exam, because in my mind, there are really just 2 functions, and that seems to be what our text is presenting. There's a second point that's raised in this section, though, which are the signs that the lineage has been activated. These two, I have a hard time tracing exactly the way they're worded here to our text. I'm not sure where these come from. If one's bodily hairs stand on end, we get kind of goose pimples, and you shed tears upon hearing about first the sufferings of psychic existence, that's a sign that your Hinayana lineage has been awakened, right? That you've generated some desire to attain some freedom from this conditioned existence. If the same signs occur upon hearing about the sufferings of sentient beings, not just your own suffering, this is a sign that the Mahayana lineage has been awakened. Again, this sign is indicated in our text, but it even talks about those things arising, the goose pimples and what have you, on the basis of hearing the teachings on emptiness. They say that's a sign that you've got some sort of you're a suitable receptacle for these teachings and can then generate all the causes that will lead you to abandon samsara and achieve nirvana. But nonetheless, I think it's perfectly fine to leave that as, one to attain freedom from samsara, and then a state of nirvana that is solitary peace, and then to attain non-abiding nirvana through thinking about the sufferings of other beings. And then we do have a brief mention of what are called here the four wheels or conditions for the awakening of the lineage. It's actually interesting. Sometimes this is referred to as the four Mahayana wheels. Those of you who do the Guru Puja or who have attended the Guru Puja, there's a verse, I think it's even possibly in the dedication verses, where they talk about the four Mahayana wheels. These aren't identified here as Mahayana distinctly, but this is a presentation in the Mahayana, right? In Buddha nature and achieving the full goal of enlightenment. So it makes sense that we would look at these as mainly the four conditions that cause the awakening of our Mahayana lineage, not just pure, straight lineage as it says here. Relying on holy beings, previous accumulation of merit, living in a conducive place, and having kind of those external conditions that allow that to happen, and then earnest prayer together with proper engagement of the mind. And we have to make prayers for things to happen. And of course, merit, without a doubt, plays a huge role. So we're going to see these things coming up in our text. I just wanted to introduce them first to you using the chart and kind of begin to correct some of the things I see there that are not exactly in line. So let's go back then to, first of all, I want to go back a few pages. This was way back when function was briefly introduced, right? Should have just put in the page number, but sorry. Okay. 34, right there. Whoops. So this is back on what, page 103? We saw the function was introduced here. It has the function of being wary of suffering and the intention and aspiration to attain peace. See, two things in my mind. Two functions. It has two functions. It gives you a weariness of suffering, samsara, allows you to see the faults of samsara and generate a wish to be separated from it. And then the intention and aspiration to attain peace, which is the opposing state, right? State of nirvana where we have removed all of what conditions us to experience samsara. And there it said, the function and quality of possessing the lineage is that it produces an intention and a yearning to attain the peace of nirvana based upon a renunciation of samsara following an understanding of the unbearable sufferings of samsara. The development of such a mind is the work of the lineage, and this process will be established later. So he doesn't completely talk about nirvana as well, but nonetheless, that's where we're at, is we're looking at this as the functions that are allowed on the basis of us having Buddha nature. Okay, so now we get to the full extensive explanation of function, which starts back on page 115 that we just left to go to verse 134. Verse 39, if the Buddha element did not exist, Buddha element is another term for Buddha nature, Buddha lineage, Tathagata essence, all of these are the same. If it didn't exist, the aversion to suffering would not occur. There would be no wanting, no striving, no aspiration for nirvana. Okay, let's go to the next page and go through the commentary here. Actually, yeah. If the naturally pure basic element of a Buddha and the uncontaminated seed did not exist, in other words, if we didn't have this sort of uncontaminated mind, and not contaminated by any stains of inherent existence, if we didn't have this kind of basic Buddha nature that can develop into Buddhahood, it follows that aversion arising from seeing the disadvantages of suffering would not occur. There would be no wanting, no striving, and no aspiration for nirvana, arising from understanding the benefits of its happiness. So again, this is kind of the proof in a way that we have Buddha nature, because we have a mind that is empty of inherent existence, and we have a mind that can develop. Therefore, these sorts of thoughts can come into our mind to be exposed to the faults of samsara. I mean, as I was going through this topic, I mean, I think it is really something to think about, to meditate on, how precious it is to be shown what we are involved in. I mean, remember, this is the very first teaching that the Buddha gave, was the truth of suffering as part of the Four Noble Truths. Again, not to make people depressed and feel horrible about things, but to see the reality of that. And then, of course, in the last two truths, to recognize that there is a state where we can have that complete cessation of that. So we see in the Four Noble Truths these two pairs, true sufferings and true origins, where we are now, and our complete situation, and then true cessations and true paths, the mirroring of these two functions that we need to see, understand completely, and get the picture of what we are involved in, so that we develop a sincere distaste for, disenchantment with samsara. And secondly, because we see that the Buddha has taught a path that leads out of this, that we have the ability to strive for nirvana by seeing the benefits of that, by knowing that this will put an end once and for all to all of our suffering. Now, again, when I use the term nirvana here, and as it's used throughout most of this, we're not just talking about solitary peace, but we do have to have some desire for pacification of the afflictive obstructions, even if we're striving to achieve Buddhahood, right? Because non-abiding nirvana entails that. It doesn't entail continuing to be in samsara. That's an extreme. We have to abandon all of these causes of suffering. We have to achieve our own pacification of our state of conditioned existence, but we don't get stuck in the peace of nirvana. We want to go on to develop again our minds to the degree where we can be a benefit to all beings. So that's the idea behind this, is that we have these two functions that are arising through our Buddha nature. The final bit of that paragraph, the proof thrown up by this consequence is the lineage of the Buddha exists in sentient beings. That's the thesis. The subject is the lineage of the Buddha. The predicate is that it exists in sentient beings. The reason or the proof is because the wish to abandon samsara brought on by aversion to it and the wish to attain nirvana can be seen to exist. So one, again, worth thinking about, as I was saying. I think this is really quite important that we meditate on this and really come to understand that this is part of the functioning of Buddha nature, is to reveal this to us, to allow us to have the space for that revelation and for our movement in that direction. And we should feel so lucky, so fortunate that we have actually met the teachings that help us to do that. Okay, so continuing on, I am going to go through this next part on scriptural authority. I won't read the beginning. It talks about the Srimala Devi, whatever, but it doesn't really, it's just citing where that is. In terms of the explanation of the text, it says the commentary from, in short, the basic element, the naturally pure lineage exists with two distinct functions, even in those sentient beings who have gone wrong, up to where Asanga says wishing means wanting, teaches how nirvana is held as a worthy goal of many excellent qualities. Wanting means moving in the direction of achieving the goal, means wanting to attain these qualities. Striving means seeking a method to attain the goal one desires, and that's self-explanatory. He says, aspiration means moving the mind toward the goal that one desires, and that refers to the joy felt on seeing that through this method one will attain nirvana. So all of those kind of get lumped together. They're identified separately in the verse: wanting, striving, aspiration. And as I said, I think they took this middle one, striving. It means seeking a method to attain the goal one desires, and they somehow made that a third function. But these are all part of the function of wishing to attain nirvana by seeing the benefits of it. You know, that you actually are driven in that direction, that's a function, and that you are also driven to want to be free of samsara. So we'll see this more when we get into this in the other parts of this section. Now we have this little thing here called proof by sequential and reverse reasoning. Let me take it off screen here. I have another little slide to share. I think I realized now that I skipped over some additional slides. Sorry about that. Let's start the slideshow again. This was from Geshe Lodin's. It's not very many slides. I think it's only like 2 or 3 slides. So let me go ahead and read this because this does give us a reiteration of what I just said. The actions or function of the potential are overviewed as follows. Again, in that verse that I started with, the 2 lines of verse 34. Renunciation arises from seeing the faults of samsara, and interest in attaining peace arises through seeing the benefits of nirvana. Seeing the faults of samsara and the benefits of nirvana are the actions of the Buddha potential, of your Buddha nature. This is expanded further in verse 139. If the uncontaminated and naturally pure seed of Buddha potential were not present, then when seeing the faults of the suffering of samsara, aversion for it would not arise. That's the reverse reasoning. If it wasn't there, then you wouldn't have that. If it is there, then you do have that. That's the sequential one, okay? Then he goes on to say, also, when seeing the benefits of the happiness of nirvana, an aspiration, longing, or desire to attain nirvana would not arise. And that would be, again, another consequence if you didn't have Buddha nature. The reasoning that explains this is that all beings have Buddha potential, because when seeing the faults of samsara, renunciation and the desire to abandon it arises, and with that, the intention to attain nirvana is seen. So again, we see that it does happen, therefore there's a sequential reasoning, but we can also see that if it wasn't there, there would be a reverse reasoning that those things wouldn't happen. And this is just a little commentary from Geshe Jumpo Gyatso, who taught on this text at Nalanda Monastery. This is what he says about it, the sequential versus reverse. What is called sequential reasoning refers to the fact that because there is Buddha nature, as a result, sentient beings can see the suffering of samsara and happiness of nirvana. Reverse reasoning refers to the implication that if there is no Buddha nature, sentient beings could not see the faults of samsara and the advantages of nirvana. Makes sense, right? Because once more, the fact that our, where's my cursor? There it is, okay. If things existed inherently, if there were no Buddha nature, if the mind wasn't naturally pure of any inherent existence, then we could never change our minds. We could never introduce new thoughts into our minds. We could never move in a different direction than what we've been doing since beginningless time. Moreover, the mind itself couldn't change and develop by moving towards nirvana, by creating the causes and conditions for that to happen. So we have these 2 different reasonings that are, one is looking at it from the point of view of, because there is Buddha nature, these things will follow. You have a sequential order to it. But also you can say, because there is no, if there were no Buddha nature, then these things wouldn't happen. That's the reverse reasoning. That makes sense to some degree. And all these things come up in Tathagata, reason, signs and reasons, signs and reasoning study that they do in the monasteries. One teacher in a commentary, I don't remember which one this was, said, well, we can see that this is true because trees, for example, they don't have Buddha nature and they don't strive to attain freedom from samsara or attain the state of nirvana. I guess it's true. I mean, we see that minds are what allows us to achieve that. Another profound thought to think about. Because we have a mind, because we are semchens, mind possessors, sentient beings, we can then attain these states. We can become, have an aversion towards samsara, develop renunciation, and so on. So let's see if I might not go through too much more tonight. How much more do I have to go? So I've got about 10 minutes. And yeah, I think I've got maybe a little more than what I want to. Let me just introduce this first and kind of the beginning of it, and then we'll start on the next page when we resume next week. It says here, seeing respectively the faults of suffering and the benefits of happiness in samsara and nirvana is the function of the lineage. That's the sequential reasoning. That we, because of our Buddha nature, our Buddha lineage, we can see the faults of samsara. We can see the benefits of happiness in nirvana. By the way, those are meant respectively. That's why it's in brackets there, but it kind of sounds weird. The faults of suffering in samsara, the benefits of happiness in nirvana. That's the function of the lineage. That's the sequential reasoning. The reverse reasoning is the last line, since those without the lineage are without seeing these. Now, is there anybody without Buddha lineage? No, because having a mind gives you Buddha nature. Every being has Buddha nature, whether they are able to take advantage of that or not. If they're born as an ant in this life, well, then as an ant, they can't achieve the disgust for samsara and the wish or aspiration for nirvana. They can't see the faults of samsara and the benefits of nirvana, but they have a mind that eventually will be exposed to the causes and conditions that will lead to that happening for them. So then we see the little, whoops, I took it off my screen somehow here. Let me stop the share and pull it back up so I can make sure I can share that with you, the rest of this. Okay. What happened there? There we go. Okay, now it's coming up. Seeing the faults of suffering and the benefits of happiness in samsara and nirvana, respectively, is the functioning of the lineage. Why? Because seeing the faults and benefits of samsara and nirvana is not found in those without lineage. Again, does anybody exist without lineage? I don't know, it's a kind of a strange proof. But as I said, you could say a tree doesn't have any desire to attain nirvana or see the faults of samsara because it doesn't have Buddha lineage, it has no mind. The first sentence expresses the sequential reasoning, which is the first 3 lines. The last sentence or last line expresses the reverse reasoning. Okay. So now what we're going to see after this, again, and we won't go into this tonight, we're going to get into the commentary that establishes this existence of the lineage through both of these, sequential and reverse reasoning, establishing it by consequence, and then looking at this longer section that I'm going to just summarize for you. That sutra, the sutra pronouncements that certain beings cannot possibly attain freedom, that there's sort of underlying meanings to that, that's just in the moment. I'm going to get into this whole kind of discussion, and I won't again belabor it because it goes on for quite a number of pages. Will there ever be a time when all beings have attained Buddhahood? If all beings have Buddha nature, it might lead you to that thinking, but then there must be an end to everyone's conditioned existence and an attainment of Buddhahood by all sentient beings. And that is held to be a possibility, right? That's what we dedicate ourselves to all the time, that we're going to be Buddhas to bring each and every sentient being without exception to the state of enlightenment. So they look at some of the consequences and some of the weird thinking that happens when you start looking at that possibility that all sentient beings will actually attain Buddhahood. And what happens to Buddhas then? What does a Buddha do when all beings are enlightened? When you no longer have a job description. So you retire at that point? Anyway, kind of interesting points. So we got just about 6 minutes or so before we want to begin discussion. Let me see if there are any questions on anything I've covered tonight or even last week. Sorry that I've kind of gone a bit on, but yeah, Stephen, please. Will the microphone help? Well, is that? Stephen's gonna use the microphone. You have to turn it on there on the side, yeah, and then maybe you'll hear it.
Check.
Okay.
Okay, that was too close. All right. Yeah, thank you, Don. So
Maybe
just
closer though.
what you were covering, just this last part of the text.
Mhm.
So having Buddha nature allows one to see the faults of samsara. I don't quite, it feels like there's a step of reasoning that's missing for me anyways. So we're talking about, it must be conventional Buddha nature because to see the faults of samsara is something that we would see conventionally. It's not kind of an ultimate realization.
Mhm.
But I don't really, well, let's take the reverse reasoning. Because I see the faults of samsara, that means, how does that imply that I have Buddha nature?
Okay. You heard that online, yes? Yeah. Yes. Okay, good. So I think it is both. I don't think it's just conventional. We look at our, again, Buddha nature has the 2 aspects. We have our naturally abiding lineage, which is the emptiness of the mind, that the mind is not inherently existent. We have to think about the consequences if that were true. If the mind was inherently existent, if we didn't have naturally abiding lineage, then the mind could never transform. again, what allows transformation to occur is that clear light nature of the mind, that the mind doesn't have any inherent existence. It's not stained by that whatsoever, that natural purity. So in a sense, I mean, this is the point that they've made previously, and I think is really driving this whole presentation of function, is that the lack of inherent existence of the mind is what allows transformation to occur, what allows the introduction of thoughts. Remember, we even had that idea of the three points that were raised in nature, the first presentation, that all sentient beings are kind of susceptible to the guiding influence of the Dharmakaya, of the wisdom of the Buddhas. So there is a receptacle, we're receiving the teachings that then help us to see the faults of samsara, see the benefits of nirvana, and move in that direction. If Buddha nature didn't exist, if we didn't have that nature of being kind of able to receive the guiding teachings of the Buddhas to move us in that direction, because the mind was inherently existent, no change could occur. And of course, that's a companion to developmental lineage, because developmental lineage is that transforming mind that is conventional, that moves all the way to the wisdom truth body of a Buddha that becomes that enlightened state from that perspective. So I think they both play a role in it, is that, emptiness is what, the emptiness of the mind is what allows for change to occur, what allows for us to be able to generate new thoughts and move in different directions. Kind of like the neuroplasticity of our minds in a much deeper way than, when we talk about neuroplasticity of our brains. Our brains show that there is an ability to change what we think and how we behave on the basis of introducing thoughts and behaviors to do that transformation. Similar with regard to Buddha nature, because the mind can change, because it's not cast in stone, because it's not inherently existent, therefore, we can introduce different thoughts that cause the mind to move not just in this life with this brain in a particular direction, but even in the future lives, all the way to Buddhahood. So I think it's both of them. That's in my thinking what is the link between, you have Buddha nature, therefore you can see the faults of samsara and the benefits of nirvana, and strive towards those goals of abandoning one and achieving the other. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, I believe it helps. I'm going to have to think about it a little bit, Don.
Okay.
But I found that analogy you used of neuroplasticity. To me, I would link that with kind of the conventional Buddha nature, our ability to remove,
Yeah.
afflictions and so on, and kind of build on what we learn.
But I think it's also our naturally abiding lineage in a sense. It's kind of like saying there's no fixed nature to the mind, in the same way that there's no fixed wiring to the brain, if you will.
Right.
I mean, I'm using it as a very loose analogy. Don't take it completely literally. But nonetheless, I think that we can see that it's the emptiness which allows for transformation to occur. I think I quoted that one verse from Nagarjuna where he says, "For the person for whom emptiness is possible, everything is possible. For the person for whom emptiness is not possible, nothing is possible." Meaning, like, if you think that things inherently exist, if that were the reality, nothing could happen. Nothing could move, nothing could change. We would be stuck in samsara endlessly.
Right. And I kind of link, on the ultimate level, I sort of link the emptiness of the mind with, well, it's a dependent arising, it's a causal process. So if we create the causes, the particular causes to achieve something, then we'll gain the results.
And there's nothing wrong. Again, dependent arising and emptiness are kind of two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
That's why it's said to be the most effective analysis for realizing emptiness, is because it points to how things exist conventionally to keep you from falling into any sort of nihilistic bent, but it also gets you to emptiness where you can remove yourself from the sort of existence, permanence sort of extreme as well. So I think that, these two, there's just different ways of looking at the same phenomenon. Form is empty, emptiness is form. That's why the Heart Sutra says that, is because it's to remind us that they exist inextricably bound up together. You are looking at conventional reality from one perspective, but you're looking at the ultimate reality from another perspective. And it's only because of both of those that we can attribute existence and transformation, Buddhahood, everything to occur, is because the two truths exist. why it's holiness. It's kind of interesting. I taught this as part of the Exploring the Truths and the Exploring Buddhism pilot. He teaches the two truths as the basis for all of the development of the understanding of the Buddhist path. He doesn't teach it in a traditional Momram way sometimes. He starts off with the two truths and then teaches the Four Noble Truths on the basis of that, and then teaches the three jewels on the basis of that. So we kind of understand the causal process of like, because of the two truths, everything is possible. Therefore, there are the truths of suffering, of conditioned existence, and there's a truth of nirvana and the true cessations and so on. There is the three jewels who have attained that state, and there are beings who haven't, who strive to accomplish that. It's all built on the basis of the two truths. And dependent arising and emptiness is the easiest way to talk about the two truths. Not that emptiness isn't a dependent arising too, because it is, but nonetheless, we're driving towards an understanding of emptiness when we look at ultimate truth, towards an understanding of dependent arising when we look at conventional truth. Okay. Let me see if there's any other questions before we do discussion. Anyone online or? Yeah, Sean, I think you've unmuted. Please, we've got the microphone, or is it on the speakers?
Well,
Go ahead.
I don't know if I have. Like I was feeling the same thing that Stephen was, just in the sense of like it feels like they're giving you this basic element of a Buddha. It says it follows that aversion arising from seeing the disadvantages of suffering would not occur. It seems like the suffering itself would cause aversion of suffering. I don't know.
I mean, to some degree, we can say that plays a role. I mean, it's obviously a condition that influences that. But if you look at the minds of most beings, they don't, even though they see suffering, they strive to abandon the coarser forms of suffering without a doubt. Most people won't run towards what causes them pain, but they will still run towards what causes them pleasure, and not seeing that that is unsatisfactory, that it's dukkha. Nor will they get the big picture that there is an abandonment of deeper causes that is necessary for us to be completely free, pervasive conditioned suffering that is our being under the control of karma and afflictions. So I think again that even when we look at it conventionally, we can say our suffering plays a role, but we still have to see a deeper level of what is meant by dukkha or suffering in order to strive to abandon samsara and to achieve nirvana. But those things play a role because they are part of our conditioned existence. But the idea here is that it's within the sphere of Buddha nature, which again is our potential to transform our minds into that through the mind being empty of inherent existence and having a developmental capacity. It's through those being there that we are able to achieve all of that. Without that being there, we wouldn't be able to accomplish it. I guess it becomes a little strange because, as I was pointing out, even when I went through the commentary where it says in the reverse reasoning, those without the Buddha lineage couldn't generate these thoughts. Well, no one is without the Buddha lineage. Trees are, and rocks are, and all these other inanimate things are. But anything that has consciousness has Buddha nature and has the ability to, by receiving these teachings and understanding these deeper levels of suffering and the potential to purify our minds through the Buddhist path, can achieve that.
I guess maybe.
Yes, these things do play a role as conditions, but I don't think they're the main cause.
I guess maybe part of the resistance to that statement maybe is just growing up in a Christian background where it's like you can't do anything without God. It's kind of that same idea. Like we obviously can do stuff all the time. I don't know.
Yeah. But I think when we talk about Buddha nature, we mean that freedom that we do possess. We often talk about this concept of free will. I hear like Venerable Rabina gets this question frequently of, is there free will in Buddhism? Well, free will is a concept that comes from Christianity and those sorts of traditions. It's hard to equate it to anything that we talk about in Buddhism, but we can say that most beings don't have what is meant by free will, and in terms of an ability to really do something different. Why? Because they're under the control of their karma and delusions. We create these patterns. We kind of like have again, when we use the analogy of the brain and neuroplasticity, you've wired your brain to act in a particular way. You just keep doing that. Why? Because you're under the control of that pattern. You don't think about diverging from that. But if you're introduced to teachings that help you to do that, then we can say there's absolute ability to be free of that patterning, of that conditioning. And that's the whole idea behind it, is that Buddha nature is possessing the ability to make that transformation, to do that. It's not reliant upon creator being, it's not reliant upon anything else. It's reliant upon us becoming aware, taking charge of our own minds, and ceasing to be under the control of the factors that have kept us cycling in existence since beginningless time. So it's a little different in that regard, I think, because it's ours. Your Buddha nature is ours. It doesn't come from anywhere else. It doesn't come from a god. It doesn't come from some a Buddha. It's your mind having the potential to develop through those two aspects: the developmental part, that is the conventional way that the mind transforms, and the emptiness of the mind that allows that transformation to take place. Okay.
I guess
I don't know.
I've come across other lineages that kind of produce that same result,
Mm.
which I guess that's maybe where I'm getting stuck, is by labeling it as Buddha, that nothing other than Buddha can do that, unless
Mm.
unless you're all these things that do that are Buddha. I mean, that's like,
Yeah. I think
I
that
mean,
we
that's
touched
like
on that in the.
that's kind of like the mystic Christians would say, all these things that produce good results are due to the blessings of God.
Mhm.
Um,
I I mean, and we've run across that idea that it's due to Buddhas that sentient beings engage in virtue. I think there's even more of it coming in the text here, but the idea is that Buddhas are essentially this force in the world that is continually trying to get beings to move in the direction that they've moved in. Why? Because it's a much better place to be. It's not like they have some vested interest in it. They don't get like extra money for every being that they enlighten or something. They're essentially, they know that this is the way out, and this is what we all have the potential to achieve. So they dedicate themselves to that and eventually achieve that state where they can do that effortlessly, spontaneously, exactly in accord with the karma of other beings. So this concept that all virtue arises through the force of the Buddha's influence. It doesn't mean, again, that we're not involved in the creation of that. We are the ones moving in that direction, but the seed of it was planted through the teachings of these great beings, which can be in any tradition. I've touched on that again, I think, in another class here. I think I mentioned when I went to teachings that His Holiness gave in Milan, where he was asked by someone in the audience, "Who is Jesus Christ according to a Buddhist perspective?" Does this sound familiar? Anyway, I mention it in teachings frequently, so I might not have mentioned it to all of you. But His Holiness's answer was, well, because he had such a positive influence on the morality and actions of so many beings, he has to be at least a high-level bodhisattva, if not a Buddha. So we don't get into like, well, I'm not going to go convince all the Christians that they're following Jesus Christ, who was a bodhisattva or a Buddha. That's not my role. My role is simply to keep moving people as much as I can, my unenlightened state, and to keep moving myself towards an enlightened state, to where I can assure that beings are can have this guiding influence in their lives, whether that guiding influence is through Mohammed, or whether it's through Jesus, or whether it's through Krishna, or whether it's through whoever, even, anyone who's kind of adopting a genuine, compassionate stance towards beings and trying to help them on this movement away from suffering towards happiness. Well, that's all the guiding influences of the Buddhas. It's what we label as Buddha. Other people are going to label it differently. So I think we can see it that way safely within a Buddhist context, but not get trapped, by that. Okay. Thank you for those questions. So that was good, Sean. We've got some time yet, maybe about 15 minutes or so for some discussion. You're welcome to kind of take a look at result, since we covered that mostly. Maybe we'll just do that. Kind of go back over result, especially maybe the discussion of these last couple verses that we went through, in terms of how these four purifications are achieved and so on, through the four causes. you don't get too hung up on all of the Four Noble Truth stuff if you don't want to. I'm not, making that kind of a major point of this. I can put on the screen, though, there is a question that pertains to that. Let me put that up here. Whoops, that was for later tonight. Where do I have that? Here it is. No, not there. There it is. So this was, again, what was partially covered last session. This is the same question from last week, and that other one was also last week. You can take a look at the chart and kind of understand the presentation, what it's about, how the four perfections are presented, the four obstacles that are overcome through the four causes, and so on. Or if you want, you can take a look at these fourfold misconceptions, again, that are set out in particular in relation to the first noble truth, truth of suffering, and the relationship of the four causes and four results to those. Okay, so spend about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll reconvene and we'll conclude for tonight. All right. See if there are any questions to wrap things up, because we've got about 5 minutes. Anything that came out of discussion or other questions that we didn't get a chance to ask? Anyone? Sean, do you have another question?
Oh no, I was just unmuted. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
But Sheila might, because I don't know that I answered her question very well.
I guess I'm having on the chart on verse 1.35 in the presentation of result. I guess I'm struggling with the grasping what is lacking a self as having a self, and then the next one in the ultimate truth, grasping what is lacking self as inherently existent. I guess I'm struggling with that portion of it.
So I was having a hard time picking up all of that, but what you're saying, let me put that on the screen. It was, again, that chart for verse 135. Here it is. So you were asking in particular about the part of it that's in the latter columns and the last column in particular, Shayla? Or?
On line 2, wisdom realizing emptiness.
Oh, okay.
To the conventional truth and ultimate truth.
Okay, so in regard to that, the last 2 columns where it says grasping what is lacking a self as having a self, that's the misconception. And then the other misconception in regard to ultimate truth is grasping what is lacking a self as inherently existent. So in the first one, we talk about the conventional truth. It means that we are taking something that actually is selfless, something that doesn't have any inherent existence, and we're thinking it does have that self. It does have that inherent existence. That's the conventional truth one. That's the mistaken idea that we have in regard to this. I know it's a little tricky because, again, this is in terms of the Four Noble Truths, these aspects were set out with a coarser view of selflessness. So what we're talking about is the self here is not inherently existent self. We mean grasping what is lacking a self-sufficient, substantially existent self as having that. This gets to be kind of a lot of words. So all sentient beings, it said, do have this coarser view of a self. This sense of, again, the controller, the master, the head salesperson who's kind of overseeing everything. We have that kind of innately from life to life. And that misconception of thinking that what lacks that self has that self is the conventional one. Why? Because it's not ultimate truth yet, because it doesn't involve inherent existence. Okay? So at the level of the Four Noble Truths, that's how selflessness is set out, is this coarser view of self. That's because, again, going back to what we said at the very beginning, that the 3 wheel turnings, at the first wheel turning, the Buddha didn't initially teach the perfection of wisdom sutras, the emptiness of inherent existence. He taught that in the second wheel turning. So in the very first wheel turning, he's teaching a coarser view of self that beings can be free of. And that is the view of this self-sufficient, substantially existent self. So the that's considered conventional from the point of view of Prasangika Madhyamaka, who hold the perfection of wisdom to be the final view. So they are saying that in that first of those two columns, the one dealing with conventional truth, that's holding something that doesn't have that type of self-sufficient, substantially existent self, to have that. Then once we negate that and we have that selflessness, then there is a mistaken view concerning the ultimate truth, which is we think that that selflessness, that lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, exists inherently. And that's the fault that we have at a more deeper level in regard to those, is seeing those aspects, impermanence and so on, as inherently existent, truly existent. Does that make sense? Maybe I've confused things more. I should have probably put on the chart a little more detail in terms of what we're negating. Maybe I should modify the chart for that. So when we go back to the chart, let me see if I can clarify it one more time using the chart. In this column here where it says the conventional truth, and it says grasping what is lacking a self, meaning a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, as actually having a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. So we're looking at ourselves as a person, and we think that there is a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, this, again, controller or head salesperson in charge of the aggregates. And that doesn't actually exist. So we have a mistaken conception, thinking that what lacks that actually has that. But then when we get to the last column, when we've done that negation and we have that selflessness, again, it's a coarse selflessness according to Prasangika Madhyamaka, we hold that we grasp that selflessness as inherently existent. Okay, so we have a misconception that occurs on the basis of that. So just like in the first one, if we look at the first one, we said that what it is we grasp what is impure as pure. So we have a mistaken conception of seeing things that are actually impure as pure. We get rid of that, but then we might still think what is impure is inherently existent. That's a deeper error. So that's kind of the logic of it. And that's why I should have put more words in here. Instead of just grasping what is lacking as self, I should have given that as, lacking the self-sufficiently, substantially existent self. And then we grasp at that selflessness as inherently existent. That's even maybe a little mistaken way that I have that there. I think I took these from his, I don't know where I took those from. Anyway, maybe I came up with them myself. I don't know. So does that make a little more sense in terms of the conventional truth? I'm sorry, go ahead. Oh, I can't hear you now. You're muted. Sorry, Sheila.
Sorry, I understand. I'm grasping a lot more. Thank you. I definitely got something I'm going to have to wrap my.
Okay, so I'll work on that chart and redo it so that it'll send out a new one so that you can have it as a little bit clearer in terms of, again, we're grasping that which is selfless in that way to have inherent existence. So, okay. Any other comments? I think I've explained that correctly. I hope I've explained that correctly. I should go back and take a look at it again myself. But. All right, let's go ahead and do some prayers then. Oh, I'm sorry, Sean.
Well, I was just going to say, but so like when they say stuff like the union of awareness and emptiness, is that used, awareness and emptiness? Like for the clear light nature of mind. Like I always felt like it's almost like this space, like, I mean, there's like nothing there but awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Is calling that a self, making it inherent, is that an example of making it inherently existing or not?
I'm not sure. I mean, again, the idea behind inherent existence is that we, regardless of whatever base we're talking about, whether it be this type of self or another type of self or a tree or whatever the case is, we're kind of adhering to some sense of it being able to establish itself, having its own identity. things do have an identity, but the identity doesn't come from the side of the object. There's no objective reality. So anytime that we're working with any phenomenon, whether we, whatever we're having as a basis, the idea is that we think that it has an ability to stand on its own, to have some sort of independent existence. And nothing has that. Everything lacks that. So these false conceptions of a self that are coarser than that are still working with a basis of an inherently existent self at a deeper level, but they're distorting it in a coarser way. Like if we look at the coarsest one, this permanent, unitary, independent self, that's again this sense of like an Atman or a soul. We think that somehow there is this other phenomenon, and you get introduced to this idea, and you adhere to there's something else that is here with this collection of stuff that is completely independent of them. It has its own sort of unchanging nature and is a unitary singular phenomenon, again, like a soul. And then you grasp at that as being real. And you have to remove those deeper or those coarser conceptions before you can get to the deeper conception of how you're holding this I or other phenomena to inherently exist. So it's different levels, but what we're getting at in the deepest one when we talk about ultimate truth on that chart is the holding things that to exist in this intrinsic way, to have some sort of identifiable nature from the side of the object that isn't merely imputed by the mind, isn't dependent upon other factors. That's the idea behind it. We should wrap up tonight. Think about that. Let me know if you have more questions next week, or you can even write to me if you want to explore things further. I may not have a lot of time to reply in the next week. Before we conclude, I want to make sure I announce that next week we are still meeting in the Gompa here, and so we'll still have class here. The following 2 weeks, I'm going to be at my mother's in Indianapolis, so it's actually going to be 2 hours later, so I might be a little sleepy. What it would be 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock at night there, but anyway, I'm going to still do the class from there, but it will be entirely on Zoom, so we won't be meeting here in the Gompa. So those of you who've been Zooming in, you're just going to have more people in the Zoom room with you on those 2 nights. I'm also going to have it a night when I do that in October, but I'll make sure you know about that well in advance. So just know that that'll be the 17th and the 24th of August. But next week we're here. All right. Let's go ahead and look at the prayers and recite some prayers together before we conclude tonight. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that bodhicitta that has not arisen, arise and grow. And may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Then for Rinpoche, peerless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable, venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and for mother living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. And lastly, just dedicate for all those beings that you're holding in their heart, whoever they might be, whatever suffering they might be experiencing, may they be free of that through what we've done here tonight and find all the causes that lead to true peace and happiness. And may this be so for all beings. By the way, what's been stirring around in my mind is that my answer to that fourth column, where Shayla brought up about ultimate truth, that's also saying like everything that lacks this substantially existent self-sufficient self, because Maybe I'll explain that a little bit more next week, but it's not just the selflessness that we're adhering to there. I was getting it confused a little bit with what we looked at tonight, but it's like everything lacks a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. Even computers do, because they don't have that. So we can say that everything that is selfless in that way, if we hold that to inherently exist, that's the deeper error that we're making there. I think that's the correct way, but I'll start with that next week and set the record straight. We'll have that corrected handout. So, all right, everyone, have a good week. I'll see you next week. Be well.